And tonight we're going to be speaking about some fascinating new international polling done by the Eurasia Group Foundation to dig into how audiences in 9 key countries around the world feel about different elements of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy and the American relationship with their countries. There's some really interesting stuff here. Our guests are Zuri Linetsky, Caroline Gray, and Lucas Robinson. Zuri is a research fellow at EGF who's worked extensively through the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa and international development. His PhD is from UVA. Caroline is a senior researcher and producer at EGF. She's previously worked at the Truman National Security Project, and she has a degree from Lewis and Clark College. And Lucas is the External Relations Associate at EGF and studied at the University of California at UCLA and at the London School of Economics. So welcome to the three of you, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, John, and to your team for inviting us and setting this event up. We're very happy to be here. So I'd like to start out by just giving a little bit of background on EGF, on the Eurasia Group Foundation, since we're relatively new and people often confuse us with the Eurasia Group. So just want to set the record straight there before we get into our reports. So the Eurasia Group Foundation was founded by Ian Bremmer, a political scientist who started the Eurasia Group about 20 years ago. It's a political risk consultancy focused on geopolitics and economic markets. And Ian, a few years ago in 2016, founded the foundation to focus more on public education and making geopolitics and foreign policy accessible to young people, to more diverse audiences outside of the Beltway. And so because of that, he thinks of us as somewhat of a non-traditional think tank. We don't just write white papers and policy papers like the one we're talking about tonight, but we produce a podcast, we produce films in different countries, we engage in the social media space heavily, publish pieces in, the likes of Teen Vogue and Now This and places you might not usually read about geopolitics and foreign affairs. So that's EGF's broad mission. And within that, is the Independent America Project, which is what Lucas, Zuri, and I work on. And that project, the mission of that project is to explore the implications, benefits, and consequences of a less militarized, less interventionist U.S. foreign policy. And we don't just look at that question in one region. We really look at the whole world and a lot of relevant issues through that lens. So a year and a half ago, we were very engaged in the Afghanistan withdrawal issue. Today, we're very engaged in the Ukraine-Russia debate, looking at U.S.-China competition, America's defense posture, budgets, things like that. So it's kind of broad-reaching. And I will turn it over to Zuri now to talk about how modeling democracy in this report we're talking about fits into all of that.
Thanks, Caroline. So the Independent Project focuses on how U.S. foreign policy can be tailored better to new global realities and to the preferences of American voters. Our research shows substantially more public support for an independent America worldview. And by that, I mean a more restrained and less interventionist.
So we do two big public opinion surveys every year because we believe in the value of public opinion, both domestically and internationally. And so in the fall, we put out a survey of domestic public opinion, looking at Americans' perceptions of U.S. foreign policy, their role in the world, and then modeling democracy, which we just released, is a survey of international public opinion, asking questions about the United States, U.S. foreign policy, American democracy, and the impetus behind this.
I'm back.
Amazing.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure exactly what happened.
It's okay.
Caroline, please forgive me. I think you just did the introduction to the IA project.
I did, and I was starting to tell a little bit about modeling democracy and why we do that survey every year.
Perfect. So Our research shows that there is substantially more public support in the United States for an independent America worldview, meaning a more restrained and less interventionist foreign policy. This survey is designed to understand what people abroad think about the United States and its foreign policy choices, and if they align with their preferences for a more restrained American foreign policy. So the question then becomes, how do we go about collecting these data? This is a survey of 9 countries. In previous years, it has been a survey of 10 countries. This year, we couldn't collect data in Russia, obviously, because of the war in Ukraine. So for this year, we collected approximately 5,000 responses from these 9 countries, about 500 responses from people in Japan, Egypt, Poland, Germany, Nigeria, Brazil, and Mexico, and about 800 responses from people in India and China. Worth noting that it's very difficult to survey people in China, and the way we get around survey censorship and just general censors in China is by not asking about Chinese politics, but by asking about Chinese impressions of American politics. To ensure that we get a more representative sample of these populations, we include some strata in our survey, meaning we have strict quotas for gender. Approximately 50% of our sample is male and 50% is female. And we created 3 kind of age bins: 18 to 35, 36 to 60, and 61 and above. To ensure the reliability of our data, we translate all of our surveys into the main language spoken in all of these countries, and then we back translate them into English. We work with our survey partner, to look for bots or professional survey takers, or people that are taking these surveys in a fraudulent way. So they're taking the surveys too quickly, or they're always selecting the same answer for each question. One of the ways we do that is by randomizing the response options. It's important to note from a methodology perspective that this is an online survey, and so it suffers from a few limitations that we did our best to mitigate. First, there's sampling bias. This is an online survey, and you can't really know who respondents are in online surveys. So we collect as much demographic data as we possibly can. And what we find is that our population is very well educated and generally employed. So this survey doesn't necessarily capture people that are lacking in internet or have limited internet literacy, and who have lower levels of education or are not fully employed. There's also a challenge of what's called social desirability bias. So people might realistically think that they're giving us the answers that we want to hear. So in a place like China, we might be getting answers that Chinese people worry that Americans might want to hear, or that they think they will not be sanctioned for by censors should anyone see what they're saying. There's 2 other forms of bias that I want to touch on quickly: acquiescence and neutrality bias that could affect this survey. Acquiescence bias is basically saying, since this is an American focused survey, they want to give us the most positive responses about the United States possible. We randomize our response choices to kind of prevent this, and we have a neutrality bias potentially problem in Japan in particular, wherein there's a cultural bias towards offering neutral responses opposed to taking an explicit position on a question. Theoretically, surveying people online provides a bit of anonymity, and so that should mitigate social desirability bias, acquiescence bias, and neutrality bias. So after that kind of long introduction, let me get into some of the findings that we have derived from our data this year. So at the first and most important thing is that between 2019 and 2021, favorable views of the United States decreased slightly. But in 2022, there was a small but statistically significant increase in respondents' favorable views of the United States. And there has been a steady yearly increase in overall favorable views of American democracy since 2020, with the largest change occurring between 2021 and 2022. Overall, respondents in 2022 reported a more favorable views of American ideas of democracy compared to previous years. There are a few outliers. Japan, as I've noted, consistently gives very highly neutral responses. Japanese respondents offer very neutral responses. On the order of 50% of respondents give us a neutral response to almost all of our questions. Germany has similarly high neutral responses, but what stands out to us is China. In China, there's been a deep downward trend in terms of their favorable views of American democracy over time. In 2019, about nearly 45% of respondents in China reported liking American democracy. In 2022, that figure decreased to 32%. Similarly, the percent of people in China that we surveyed who reported strongly disliking American-style democracy nearly tripled from 2019, from 5% in 2019 to 17% in 2022. So the question then becomes, why do people like or dislike the United States? We find that the two most popular categories or reasons why people like American ideas of democracy is that the United States provides protections for individual liberties, like the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. And the United States has laws that are better when American laws are better because politicians are responsive to voters. When asked why people dislike American-style democracy, for those who hold negative views of American democracy, the most commonly cited rationale was the American idea of democracy is hypocritical. Ordinary voters don't actually have power. So to follow up with these responses, we asked our respondents what would make American democracy more attractive in their country, and to rank their top choices of what would make the United States more attractive, American-style democracy more attractive in their country. 3 response categories which received the highest number of first choice rankings were closing the gap in income between the rich and poor, allowing more immigrants and refugees to enter the United States, and treating minority groups more fairly. It's also worth noting that tied for fourth in this case, are a more restrained foreign policy and climate, and taking more action or passing laws to deal with the threat of climate change. So now that I've talked to you about kind of views of American democracy and views of America in general, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Lucas, who will talk about specific foreign policy issues.
Thank you, Zuri. So, in addition to better understanding how our survey respondents view the United States and its democracy, we also wanted to learn more about how our survey participants view America's global influence, different forms of American power, be it hard power or soft power, and relevant US foreign policy decisions made during the Biden administration. We also want to know how respondents differentiate between different threats. And so we asked them what they thought was the most significant threat to international security. We provided 5 answer choices. These were 1, the spread of nuclear weapons; 2, the rise of violent extremism and terrorism; 3, powerful countries competing for influence, aka great power competition; 4, climate change and global warming; and finally, 5, authoritarianism. Interestingly, we found that despite democracy's global decline, authoritarianism is seen as the least pressing international threat. Climate change was seen as the second least popular answer choice. And while both great power competition and terrorism were seen by nearly 1 in 5 people as the greatest threat. And as you can see by the graph right here, a plurality of respondents view nuclear proliferation as the biggest threat to international security, which isn't that surprising considering that many countries surveyed, like Egypt and the Middle East, are in regions recognized at being at high risk for nuclear proliferation, while other countries that we surveyed, like Germany, Poland, and India, are in regions with nuclear-armed adversaries. And certainly the general discussion surrounding nuclear weapons and their associated risks, which has been spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, could have influenced respondents' views on nuclear proliferation and could have influenced them seeing nuclear proliferation as the most pressing international security threat. So with this finding as a backdrop, I'd like to turn your attention to our data on recent foreign policy decisions, beginning first with those fielded on Russia's war in Ukraine. So, as you know, the United States has implemented broad economic sanctions on Russia and has given Ukraine billions of dollars in humanitarian and military aid. Meanwhile, as foreign policy circles debate what America's aims should be as it supports Ukraine, whether that's to support a negotiated settlement or to weaken Russia, there have been calls by many for the Biden administration to do even more. So therefore, we thought it'd be interesting to ask respondents whether they thought America has responded to Russia's war in Ukraine well. And we found that more than twice as many agreed with America's response as disagreed. And when we took a closer look at the two NATO countries we surveyed, Germany and Poland, we found that in Poland, a significant majority agree with how the United States has handled its response. While in Germany, views are a bit more mixed. While half agree with Washington's response, more than a third hold a neutral opinion. And overall, among all of our survey respondents who agreed with how the United States has responded, we found that a plurality think America responded well because it avoided a direct conflict with Russia. The second most frequently selected reason, after avoiding war with Russia, was America's strengthening of the Ukrainian resistance through military aid, which is a view that's held by nearly half of respondents in both Poland and Germany. We found that the two least popular rationales were America's encouragement of NATO to strengthen Europe's self-defense capability and America's undermining of the Russian economy. These findings, interestingly, somewhat mirrored respondents' views on the goals they thought the United States should pursue as it prioritizes its goals in response to Russia's invasion. When asked to rank the most important goal the United States should pursue, over half said avoiding a direct war between nuclear armed powers, i.e. the United States and Russia. The second most popular goal, which was chosen by over a third of respondents, was preventing the suffering of the Ukrainian people. While the third most popular goal, chosen by nearly a quarter, was preserving Ukraine's territory. And we found that the two least popular goals among respondents were defending democratic countries from autocratic countries and weakening Russia to punish it for its aggression. And so finally, we also want to know why those who disagreed with America's response to the war in Ukraine felt the way they did. However, it was difficult to assess respondents' rationales as nearly half selected none of the above. The four other answer choices we did provide were: one, the United States should send its military to defend Ukraine. Two, the United States should implement harsher sanctions. Three, the United States should send advanced weapons like tanks and planes to Ukraine. And four, the United States should try to remove Vladimir Putin from power. However, none of these four answer options were selected by more than 16% of respondents. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Caroline, who has some interesting data on how our respondents view America's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan.
So next month is the 1-year anniversary of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And because of that, the Biden administration is probably in for some pretty harsh criticism, given that it was received so poorly by politicians in Washington and by the mainstream media. But given this was such a major event, America ending its 20-year war, we thought it was still relevant and important to investigate in our survey and to see what respondents in these countries thought about U.S. policy in Afghanistan. So we asked respondents whether they supported or opposed America's decision last summer to withdraw. And this is, of course, after the withdrawal. So people saw the aftermath of it. And what we found is that nearly half of all respondents in 9 countries, or 49%, supported the decision to withdraw all American troops. And this is compared to only 20% who opposed it. And this is an important finding because in many ways it shows that the Biden administration's decision, despite the chaos that we all saw on TV that took place in Kabul in the days that followed, the decision was more popular than unpopular internationally. We were also curious to know what survey takers in these countries thought about U.S. policy toward Afghanistan post-U.S. troops leaving. And as many of you know, after the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, once U.S. troops left, the Biden administration's response was to freeze nearly $10 billion of Afghan assets to prevent that money from going into the hands of the Taliban. So we wanted to ask about this as well, given that it has created humanitarian concerns and problems. Afghans are not able to get money or access their money in banks. So we asked about this, and we found that 49% or half of our respondents believe that the U.S. should continue sending economic assistance to Afghanistan, even if it means engaging with the Taliban government. And that's compared to 29% of respondents who believe that we should not be engaging with the Taliban at all, even if it means Afghans receiving less economic support and assistance. So I would say the big takeaway here with this question is that, despite what we may hear in the news in the US, the withdrawal was received much more positively than it was received negatively. And that economic assistance should continue despite the Taliban being in power. And now we will chat about our data regarding U.S.-China competition. Zuri.
Thanks, Caroline. So obviously one of the pressing threats that Lucas talked about a little bit earlier is competition between great powers. And the primary example of that is China-United States competition. So we were actually curious about whether international audiences that we can reach think that competition is actually happening. And lo and behold, about 80% of the people we surveyed said that the United States and China are competing for international influence. On the bright side, about 3/4 of those that we surveyed said that having the United States as the world's leading power would be better for their country and the world. When asked why, and this is the graph that we're showing you, the top 3 reasons were largely domestic. The United States is the largest economy in the world and is a trustworthy economic partner. The United States sets a good example for national development, and the United States values individual freedoms more than other countries. Similarly, we asked the same question for people that voted for China. And again, we see the economy and domestic politics mattering. China sets a good example for national development. China values economic policy and political stability over individual freedoms. And China does not interfere in the politics of my country. So this kind of sets out an agenda right now for Biden as he thinks through all of his Asia Pacific initiatives, and could theoretically inform his current trip to the Middle East in terms of how it augurs for kind of competition between the great powers. It's also it's really important to talk about the different forms of power that the United States has. For reasons of kind of simplicity, we broke power into two types: soft power and hard power. Soft power is a concept developed by Joseph Nye at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. And so we define hard power as military force. And soft power is kind of cultural exports, culture, economic issues, and generally non-military influence. To estimate how countries view American military power, we asked two questions. Do respondents have positive or negative views of military to military collaboration with the United States? And how do they have positive or negative views of the sale of American military weapons and vehicles to these countries? To gather data on soft power, we asked respondents about how positively or negatively they viewed American cultural exports like movies, music, and television, and the presence of American non-governmental organizations. When we talk about hard power, right around 50% of people have positive views of military to military collaboration with the United States, just over 50% actually. And just under 50% view the sale of American military hardware positively. There is one big outlier that actually John pointed out, which was in an earlier conversation, Egypt. Egypt is a major recipient of American military aid, and something on the order of $4 billion a year. And roughly 60% of Egyptians that we surveyed reported unfavorable views of military collaboration with the United States. And a large percentage of Egyptians, over 50%, reported negative views of the sale of arms to their country as well. So maybe F-35 deals should be taken off the table. I don't know, just a guess. The one question that is connected to this in terms of hard power is the role of American military bases abroad. As many of you probably know, the United States operates approximately 750 military bases across 80 countries, with the largest number of bases and troops in Germany and Japan. We asked our respondents if they agree or disagree that the presence of US military bases threatens the independence of their country. About 50% agreed with that statement. In Mexico, Egypt, and India, at least half of the respondents said that they agreed that American military bases threaten their country's independence. Unsurprisingly, about 70% of people in China agreed with that statement. When we switching to soft power, American soft power is almost universally positively accepted. And almost is really important, because majorities in nearly all of the countries surveyed reported extremely positive views of American music, movies, and television. Who doesn't love Avatar? And I know I loved Modern Family. Even China, Chinese respondents, about 60% of them said that they viewed American music, movies, and television positively. I wish we had data on Top Gun, though, the new Top Gun. Again, though, Egypt stands out because 65% of Egyptians reported negative views of American soft power. Turning to the NGO question, again, we have majorities in 5 of 9 countries reporting positive views of American NGOs. China and Egypt again stand out as having less favorable views of American NGOs in their countries. I wish I could dive more into these data a little bit more. These are kind of wonderful questions as to why for future research. Some speculative ideas revolve around culture and kind of longer histories of contentious relationships. But those are more kind of suppositions than anything. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to talk a little bit about the drivers underlying some of these data.
So here I'm going to just briefly talk about some overarching trends we saw throughout our data, throughout a lot of the questions we asked. So the first is age. Respondents who are older tend to view the US and American democracy and its policies more favorably. So respondents in the highest age category, 61 and older, again, tend to view American democracy more favorably. For example, about 50% of respondents between 18 and 31, our youngest age category, view American democracy positively compared to 60% of respondents above the age of 60. So there is a difference there for sure. Education is also a major factor. Respondents who are more educated tend to view the US and its democracy more favorably. And this is definitely more pronounced in some countries. For example, in India, almost 90% of respondents with a graduate degree view American democracy positively compared to about 50% of people in India with a primary level education. So that's a pretty massive discrepancy there. And then the last major factor we tracked, which seems like the most interesting to me, is diaspora connections. So respondents who have visited the US, lived here, who have family or friends that live here, those people are much more likely to view the US and American democracy favorably than those who have no association or connection to the States. And this is highlighted really well in our China data. So among Chinese respondents, 53% of Chinese respondents who have visited the US have favorable views of American democracy compared to just 19% who have never visited the States. And so it seems to be a major driver in terms of how positively or negatively people in these countries view American democracy in particular. So these trends, we think, like Zuri was talking about, have interesting implications for U.S. foreign policy. Definitely the findings about diaspora connections, imply that potentially more open immigration policy might positively contribute to U.S. national security and pro-U.S. sentiment abroad. Maybe more cross-cultural exchange or public diplomacy in places like China would benefit the U.S.-China relationship. And then, of course, going back to kind of this discussion about U.S. hard power and U.S. soft power, it's interesting to think about how soft power goes a long way in terms of showing America's strength and benefit to the world as compared to hard power, which doesn't seem to go as far. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, John, and we're excited to answer some questions and have a bit of a discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there were some really fascinating results, and the full report, I'll drop the link in the chat in a moment, has some other stuff that's really cool too. I definitely encourage folks to check it out. One of the things I was curious about is, there's been talk of a divergence in perceptions of the Ukraine conflict between what you might call the global north, or really the West, and the global south. Did you see patterns like that emerging in these survey data?
We did not. We tried, but it was not a driver for our results. Now, it's possible a couple of the questions that were raised about methodological issues in the sample, it's possible it's a function of our sample. It's possible that it's also, so that's one potential reason for this. There's another potential explanation for this, is that views of Ukraine are kind of related to other things that are not global south versus global north. So that could be kind of a measure of something else that we're not picking up in our survey, or that we can't pick up yet because of our sample.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about why you couldn't survey in Russia this year. What's the story there?
It's a great question. So because this is an online survey, we work with a partner, and the partner has what are called survey panels. So they have people that they know, they have a roster of people that they will send an email out to and say, hey, take this survey. And that was impossible because of censorship, frankly, in the Russian context. It just wasn't possible to do. That's
very interesting. Another pattern that I've noticed in the past in some of the other global surveys, like some of the surveys Pew has done, is that it seems like there's a little bit of a seesaw in some European countries in particular in views favorability toward the United States based on whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican, basically. Do you see a sense of more partisan variation? Like, was there a big swing in some of the European countries from Trump to Biden? Because I think some of their data captured that.
I can take that briefly. Yeah, I think this year we saw, or in the past years, we saw more positive views in Germany for the first time, and that coincided with Biden becoming president. And so we don't know that that's the exact reason why positive views are going up in a country like Germany, but it's definitely a possibility.
So I've got a question from one of our attendees who asks, does the survey include people from specific political beliefs or parties or not? They ask, the opinion of the 500 or 800 people from countries you mentioned may not be the real picture of the society's view because the whole population is so large.
Caroline, do you want to hop in, or do you want me to take this?
Yeah, I can start. So as Zuri mentioned in the beginning, this data we collected skews, the respondents skew urban and educated. And so that might have some bearing on political beliefs or values. We didn't ask those kinds of questions, so we don't know for sure. But there is the data is skewed in that sense. Zuri, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. So the problem that we have is that it's actually really hard to capture through an online survey. It's hard to create a quota for people, right, in terms of their political beliefs, because it's just very difficult. You actually have to ask this question. The problem is that because we're talking about this variety of countries, in some of these countries, center left and center right can actually flip. So you might actually, a center left person it might mean something different to be center left in one country than it does in a different country. So it's a rather complicated bit of information. It's not complicated, but we didn't collect it. It's a bit complicated to collect, but the question is a good one, and we can try to do it in the future. Yeah.
I've got a question. I think you guys addressed some of this earlier from Joanna Rospodowski about what methodological flaws or challenges you've identified in your survey design, and how do you account for, or what do you make of all the neutrality across all the questions? I know you mentioned a neutrality bias, but it is also striking that even in places that aren't Japan, there are just a lot of people who don't seem to have a strong view either way.
So I'll start this off and I'll let my colleagues hop in. So the neutrality issue is an interesting one. Because we rely on Likert scale questions, if you don't feel strongly about a question, neutral kind of is the best answer. And so that can be neutrality bias, but it also could be that you just don't think about this stuff. This is a meeting of the John Quincy Adams Society, and we work at the Eurasia Group Foundation, which is focused on politics. But the people who are taking the survey might realistically just not be that interested. And so this might be their way of saying, I don't know. In an ideal world, we would actually have an open response category for all the neutrals, and say, if you have a neutral response, is there, why, or is this, or we would put, I don't know. And in some cases we actually ask if people don't know. But it's, that's kind of what's happening here. It is a discrete category. But because of the nature of our survey, it was done incredibly quickly. Online, and we needed to get this done very quickly. we couldn't process all those open responses because we'd have to translate them into English and then code them. And so it was just logistically difficult. So the methodological questions that your two participants have raised are valid and good questions. And they're things that we wrestled with and made choices, and made the choices that we did by virtue of the limitations that we had.
So we got a question from Dong Hui Yu, who asks, how do you interpret the decreasing favorability of people in China for American democracy, and just more broadly for a lot of the things about the United States that showed up across several of the questions? What factors do you think might be behind that trend?
So, I mean, clearly the data shows that people-to-people connections lead to more favorable attitudes of the U.S. and American democracy. And we can assume, based on deteriorating relations between the U.S. and China over the past many years, that this has likely contributed to, increasing unfavorable views of American democracy in China. And that's because, American academics, it goes both ways. American academics and journalists aren't able to live and do the work they want to do in China anymore, and vice versa. Chinese students and Chinese scholars, it's not the same kind of home for them in the US that it once was. And so I think we have to look at those people-to-people relations and connections and see how it does influence these kind of bigger geopolitical questions.
So we've got another question from Brian Choquette, who asks, I'm curious about the principal national security concern that people identified being nuclear proliferation. And so just kind of a few sub-questions there. In prior years, did you see variance on this between like Russia and China, or like NATO countries and places that don't have nuclear weapons? Like, how do you interpret the nuclear element here?
So this was actually the first year that we fielded this question. So we don't have data from previous years, obviously, and no data from Russia, but I am interested in seeing how this data does play out year by year in the future, depending on, the big issues of the year it's surveyed. And what we did find that the proliferation of nuclear weapons as the greatest threat to international security, that was most pronounced in Brazil, Egypt, Germany, Mexico, and Poland, though it was high in all the countries we surveyed. I think there is something interesting there that those countries don't have nuclear weapons, and it could be. So I'm interested in knowing what the reasons for that is. Maybe Zuri, if you have any idea.
So before I answer that, I think Brian wrote countries that do have nuclear arsenals, like Brazil. Just to note, Brazil doesn't have a nuclear arsenal. It has a nuclear fuel program. It leases nuclear energy to itself, but it doesn't have a nuclear arsenal. I think that there is a recency bias in all surveys. What we're seeing now is, with the rise, with people paying more and more attention to tension between China and the United States, and then North Korea is always launching things. Nuclear weapons are worry people, and then now Russia. I mean, Vladimir Putin, a month before we fielded our survey, said, I am raising the readiness of our nuclear arsenal. What did that mean? Not a lot, but it raised, people's hair stood on edge a little bit. And so a lot of people are talking about this is the closest we've come to, nuclear conflict, and since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I think that this is a function of kind of world politics and probably also a function of recency bias.
And on this question, I mean, what I find most fascinating is that, given President Biden's focus on this contest between democracy and authoritarianism and trying to bring all of the world's democracies on board to fight authoritarian governments like Russia, that language doesn't seem to have caught on. Authoritarianism was the least selected answer option among the greatest threats. So I find that interesting, and I wonder if that'll change in future years if he continues using that language.
Well, yeah, and I was going to follow up on the democracy and autocracy narrative, because there's definitely been some play on that narrative in Washington and attempts to make it an international narrative. Another narrative that's been out there as a potential competing narratives for American foreign policy, especially in the Pacific. There's talk of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is often taken to be more like a shared defense of national sovereignty on the part of allies in that area. Is that something that might catch on? What like, if you're an American strategist and are trying to say what are things that other publics are most likely to be supportive of for the purposes of like organizing American strategy, what do you see there? What rationales are they going to be excited about?
I mean, the most obvious answer based on, the question we asked about, why do you prefer the US over China? It has to do with economics and trade, right? It's not about human rights and democracy and these liberal values that the US talks about. It's about, who can help my country economically the most. And so I think that's an important piece to consider for the US. And the other thing we didn't mention is that you asked about the global South, global North kind of split, but what was even what split did stand out to us was countries that were treaty allies versus non-treaty allies. And actually the countries that do have formal collective defense treaties with the United States have more unfavorable views of the US than non-allied countries. And so we spend so much time talking about shared values with our allies, working with our allies, but people in those countries seem to like us the least. So it's interesting that we focus so much on this rhetoric and talking about America's grand strategy and whatnot.
And just to piggyback off of that, right? We have a finding about a more restrained foreign policy. What's interesting, and this kind of dovetails with the next question about China, well, is related to the next question about China. China has had these kind of has these principles of foreign aid and international relations, one of which is about non-intervention in the politics of the countries that they work with. This has been a guiding principle for them since Deng Xiaoping, so in the late 70s after Mao died. And that's something that matters, right? Because the United States, Biden has one of the kind of quintessential Bidenisms is let's talk about the power of the American example rather than the example of American power. But the thing is that, the United States will say, hey, we want this, but do this for us. China doesn't do that. Whether it's from military or economic benefit, China is looking for primarily economic relations and doesn't meddle in these countries' internal politics. And realistically, its foreign policy is fairly restrained. It doesn't go about the world meddling anywhere. Even if you look at its border disputes, it handles them fairly quietly, with not a lot of kind of saber rattling. In fact, it gives ground in a lot of cases. Taylor Fravel, a professor at MIT, has a book about this. So it's something that we should be thinking about. In fact, if the audience is interested, there was an op-ed in the New York Times maybe a week ago by a person from the Solomon Islands talking about why they decided to sign a trade deal or military deal with China. And basically the answer is, well, you didn't really pay any attention to us and China did. That's the crux of it. And I don't want to put words into that op-ed. So I recommend that your audience looks it up. But this is what Caroline is talking about. It's about economics, it's about non-interference, and it's about ultimately paying attention. And that's what excites people, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. And there's actually more data on this. There's a lot of data on this about the economics of the Indo-Pacific region and non-meddling.
Yeah, to Caroline's point earlier about allies and shared values, the World Values Survey data is out there. It is pretty fascinating. You can browse it on the internet. There are a number of NATO members, particularly Turkey and Albania, that do not square with some of the narratives you'll hear in more Western NATO countries and the United States about NATO as a kind of alliance for global progressive social values, specifically, not liberal values, but like specific social values. We've got a question here that you alluded to, Zuri, from Daniel McVicker about this negative swing in Chinese opinion toward the United States. Is this an outlier compared to past changes in favorability? I'm also curious, when I was looking through some of the data in your full survey, it seemed like there was also some people in China who were starting to be more pro-U.S. Like the number of people evincing strongly pro-U.S. positions was still really small, but it seemed to grow a little. And I kind of wondered about that because I know in the past, Soviet dissidents would talk about, well, like the regime that I hated kept saying Israel was bad, so I started liking whatever Israel did, and I figured whatever they said was a lie. I wonder, could there be something going on there, or just people feeling more strongly about foreign policy generally? What do you think is up?
Lucas, do you want to take a stab at that?
I think you could offer a better answer than me, Zuri.
I mean, to this question about, is this historically significant? We only have 4 years of data that we've collected. I know Pew and the Chicago Council and some other organizations have been around much longer who could take a more holistic look over time of that trend. So it's hard to say that change in Chinese favorability, the one you're mentioning, John, it wasn't a statistically significant change, so we didn't really call attention to it. Whereas the unfavorable views increasing was, so that's why we highlighted that.
And just to add, just to piggyback off of what Caroline is saying, and this is a great question. The international politics affects people domestically, right? There's a line of thinking in international relations called second image reversed, famous article by Peter Gurevich. I think it's published in 1978, but there's actually a lot of thinking about this. And so is it a historically significant swing? I know that it's a statistically significant swing. In terms of the broad arc of history, we'd have to look at a longer time horizon, which is what Caroline is getting at. And what I really like about our data is that year over year, we're seeing this kind of switch to a more negative view in China. And so we don't know what's driving it. There's any number of potential explanations, but we do know that within the range of people that we are able to reach with our survey, that this continues to drop. So that's meaningful and significant for us. And I'm sorry, we can't provide a more fulsome answer that would that would require some more data collection, which we hope to do, frankly.
So, yeah, and so one closing question that we ask all of our guests, what's one piece of advice that you'd give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps professionally?
I can start with that, and then maybe we can all answer. I've, since graduating from undergrad, have just really been in the think tank world at various think tanks. And both when I was applying for positions and now in a position where I'm hiring people, interns and different staff, is having really good writing samples, being able to write non-academic articles, being able to write for general audiences. I think that'll help you in any job you're trying to get in the foreign policy space. And so carving out time to do some of that, even if you're not publishing it, I think goes a long way when you're applying for these kinds of jobs, because it's so important to be a good writer and a clear communicator. I'll leave it there.
Well, and on that, before you go next, Lucas, I have to mention, I swear, Caroline and I did not coordinate this, but applications for the Marcellus Policy Fellowship are currently open. I'm dropping the link in the chat right now. This is about teaching people how to break bad academic writing habits and write effectively for policy audiences, write policy analysis like you'd see at a think tank, write an op-ed, and generally build up those skills and build up your writing samples. So great pitch, Caroline.
Do it. Yeah, that's
Marcellus
great.
Policy Fellowship applications are open. Lucas, you were about to talk.
Yeah. On that line of writing, I would say also read as much as you can, foreign policy related stuff, but also, fiction and anything that will, kind of help your creativity and your imagination. And also I would say learn to take deep breaths. I know that when I graduated from grad school, very nervous about my future. But it's important to take deep breaths and relax. So I'll help you think more clearly.
That's great advice, Lucas. I'm doing it right now. I think, so I'm going to break the mold a little bit. Writing obviously, but I'm going to say, don't go straight to a think tank. I'm going to say, don't work in this world for a couple of years. Leave school, leave the world in which you've been comfortable and you've been learning, and go out into the world. The best thing that I ever did for myself after I got my PhD, I moved to Egypt, and I bounced between Egypt and South Sudan and Lebanon, and for a couple of years, and then I ended up in Somalia for a while and in Nigeria for a while, and a lot of these weird places, weird from an American perspective. And I had to write because my job was to do analysis and evaluation. It's not policy writing as we think about it, but it's writing. Any writing matters, right? If you want to write, it doesn't matter if you're writing for Dissent or for the Spectator or for the American Conservative or for or for Quincy or for John Quincy Adams Society. It matters just that you're putting words on page, right? The pen to paper, if you will, although no one does that anymore. My favorite writers consistently had either time or word goals per day, and that's kind of something that I've adhered to since graduate school. But the most important thing is, outside of words on page, is go learn about the world. And the best way to learn about the world is being out in the world. And there are so many opportunities. Mark Twain said this: the best way to get rid of bigots is by telling them to go out into the world. And I'm not saying anyone on this call is a bigot, but what I think the message from him was, there's so much in the world that we consume through any number of different forms of media. But seeing it and living it and smelling it and touching it informs your writing. It informs the warmth in your writing and the depth of your writing and the feeling in your writing. And I think, the people that I love the most in this world are people who are out there, who are going to Libya, who are going to Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, who are writing about Syria because they're crossing the border from Gaziantep, or know that the best knafa in the world is in this small place in the old city of Nablus in the West Bank. That's the stuff that really matters. It's the meat and potatoes of writing.
All right. Well, with that, Caroline, Lucas, Zuri, thank you to you. The full survey is at the Eurasia Group Foundation's website. Thank you to all of you who attended. This has been another Wednesday digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. Good night to everyone.